Hey everybody, if you don't know me already, I'm Sam. I just have a little presentation I put together about the Pine Barrens tree frog for you guys. So to start off, I just want to go over some surface level facts about this species, just to kind of familiarize everybody with them. So the scientific name for the Pine Barrens tree frog is Hyla andersoni. They're from the order Anora. So they're most closely related to other frogs and toads, but they're also amphibians, so they're pretty closely related to newts and salamanders as well. That's not written in the slides, but I just thought it was important to include. So second off for facts, they're insectivores, so they eat a lot of ants, flies, beetles, spiders, other kinds of bugs. And there's obviously a lot of different insect species within the Pine Barrens, as we talked about in class, so they have a lot to choose from for eating. And also, another thing I didn't feel like was important enough to mention in the slide, but I'm still going to talk about it. The tadpoles are herbivores, so they eat aquatic plants. Next, I wanted to just mention some of the specific habitat types that the Pine Barrens tree frog occupies. So I wanted to include some specific examples that we talked about when we were doing our REAs. So a lot of the time, these frogs will be prone to areas where it's damp, heavy vegetation, and they need bodies of water to lay their eggs. So some of the major habitat types that they would choose would be shrubby wetlands, cedar swamps, hardwood swamps, lowland transitional areas, and vernal pools. I'm sure there's also some ponds and lakes that have tree frog eggs there. Last out of the quick facts that I have on my slide here, I want to talk about their range because, of course, they are living in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, or else I wouldn't be talking about them. But there's also a few other locations along the East Coast where they are native. These areas are the Carolina Sandhills in both North and South Carolina, and there's also a few locations in southern Alabama and the Florida Panhandle where they live. Next, I wanted to talk about the life cycle of the Pine Barrens tree frog. So, like all frogs, they start out as eggs. They lay their eggs in the water. This is kind of unlike most frog species. Female Pine Barrens tree frogs, rather than laying a strand of eggs or like a clump of eggs, they release them one at a time, and this helps them to disperse so that predators are less likely to eat all of the eggs at once. And Pine Barrens tree frogs can lay up to 800 eggs at one time. Their incubation period, once they're as eggs, can last from a few days to 2 weeks, and this depends on the water temperature that they're laid in. Once the tadpoles hatch, they grow these little gills out of the side of their heads, kind of similar to axolotl gills that stick out the side, if you've ever seen those. I believe there's an arrow pointing to the gills in the diagram that I drew. Then these tadpoles will grow over the course of 5 to 7 weeks. Once the tadpoles survive to this point, they'll start to grow legs, and their tail will shrink in. And then they enter what is called the froglet stage, when they're just kind of like a frog with a tail at that point. And they're a little smaller than adult frogs. So as you can see in the diagram, the tadpole's limbs kind of start out as little nubs or little buds, and then they eventually will grow into full limbs. The most significant changes in the frog's physical appearance will occur in the last 10 or so days of the metamorphosis period. So the digestive system at this point changes to adapt from consuming mostly plants to be able to digest bugs. And the eyes will move from the sides of the head to the top of the head, and they will develop ear structures, and their gills will kind of just go away. The adult frog will spend 2 to 3 years on land, and at that point it will be mature enough to reproduce, and then the cycle will start back over again. So, like I mentioned before, there are several places in the United States where Pine Barren tree frogs are native. The populations in these locations are all the same species, but there is evidence of phylogenetic divergence amongst these and between these populations in different areas. So there was a study in 2021 that was conducted to trace back to where these divergences occurred. The major phylogenetic divergence that separated the more northern populations, so New Jersey and the Carolinas, from the more southern populations in Florida and Alabama, that occurred approximately 0.9 million years ago. And then there was a second phylogenetic divergence that occurred about 0.15 million years ago, and that one is the one that separated the New Jersey species from the Carolina species. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the ecology of this species within the Pine Barrens itself. So first off, frogs are a really good indicator species. This is most species of frogs, but I'm going to use this in general, talking about Pine Barrens tree frogs. So indicator species, they're essentially like the first species to start dying out when the environmental conditions are changing for the worst. So indicator species are usually more fragile and sensitive to their environment. So this would be like frogs, birds, things like that. And ecologists can use the disappearance of these species to decipher when an area is starting to go into environmental conditions that aren't necessarily ideal, and they can try to figure out what exactly is going wrong. The Pine Barrens tree frogs also a very important part of the food web within the Pine Barrens. Their main predators are garter snakes, but there's also a lot of other things that eat tree frogs. So like this is other snake species, and then even the tadpoles can be eaten by like beetles and salamanders, turtles, and even other species of frogs sometimes. So that affects the tadpoles and the eggs of the Pine Barrens tree frog. So the process of succession can also affect how the Pine Barrens tree frogs interact with their environment. So during early succession, when new tree species begin to take over, this process can kind of limit the tree frog's habitat depending on what trees are growing back first and becoming the most dominant within the area. Succession also occurs after winter seasons when it starts getting warm outside again. And if it gets warm too quickly at the end of the winter and we rush into like summer instead of kind of having a nice like mild spring, it can dry up vernal pools and other bodies of water that frogs need to lay their eggs, and then they won't be able to breed for that season. Lastly, so invasive species can have an effect for Pine Barrens tree frogs as well. And this is kind of related to what I was talking about with the new tree species, especially with aquatic plants as well. So when new aquatic plants get introduced into an ecosystem and take over the plants that were previously there, the tadpoles might not be able to eat the new plants that are growing there and eventually starve. So as far as current status goes, the Pine Barrens tree frog is currently on the list of endangered species in New Jersey. Their population numbers are pretty small, but they are still considered to be a stable population since they're no longer being depleted at such a high rate as they used to be. The Pine Barrens tree frogs were seeing a big decline from like the 1950s to the 1980s, and that's when people started doing things to help preserve the species. So yeah, they're considered stable at this point. They're not on the national list of endangered species though. As far as the future goes for Pine Barrens tree frogs, it's very important to preserve this species despite the stability of their population that I talked about. The Pine Barrens is a very complex ecosystem, and it's a mosaic of habitats, as we talked about. It's very important for us to limit the amount of pollution that we're putting out into the Pine Barrens, especially the water and the air, because frogs are delicate, they breathe through their skin, and they're very sensitive to their environments.